everyone. Thank you so much for coming to our panel this afternoon on marketing and advertising redefined in the age of AI. I'd like to introduce my lovely panelists. First of all, Anastasia Leng, who is the founder and CEO of Picasso Labs. Then Jessica Rusu, who is the Senior Director of Analytics and Research at eBay. And Ben Livshits, who's the Chief Scientist at Brave Software. Thank you so much for joining me for this panel. So perhaps we'll start off by just hearing a bit from our panelists about how they've been using artificial intelligence and machine learning in each of their individual business areas. Should we start with you, Anastasia?
Sure. So hi, everyone. My name is sorry, put that back on. My name is Anastasia Leng. I'm the founder and CEO of Picasso Labs. And what we're doing is using AI to automate creative decision making. And I know that sounds crazy, but basically what we're seeing is that the majority of communication that's being done today is being done visually, namely through imagery and video. And when we look at the evolution of marketing and advertising, we're using data to make fundamental decisions about everything from who our audience is, where they are, what time of day we need to reach them, what site we need to reach them on. But the one part of this process that's remained subjective and devoid of data is the creative. That pretty much is still intuition-based. And so what we're doing is we're using computer vision to take every single creative that a brand has, break it down to hundreds of thousands of visual cues, and map each of those visual cues to how consumers react to them. So what we're effectively doing is understanding the visual preferences of different consumer segments. So for example, if you're a company like Unilever, we can tell you everything from how the model's hair color, her facial expression, if she's sitting down or standing up, changes click-through rate to conversion, how that changes based on the market the customer is in, whether they're male or female, or whether they're 18 to 24 and 65 and up. So it's sort of that data that Google has given us for keywords, but now brought to the visual level.
Fantastic. Jessica, what about the client perspective on this?
Yeah, so at eBay, we like to think about the customer, and so we're using artificial intelligence and machine learning to do three major things. The first thing is doing an AI-managed marketplace. So for a long time, we've had algorithms to help us do supply and demand matching things that you want with sellers that have them. We're also looking at price optimization, and we're also using machine learning to help us do things like shop the look. So if you're out there and you're browsing on Twitter or Facebook or Pinterest and you see something that you like, as Anastasia says, and you see something that is interesting to you, you can go and find that straight away on eBay. And we're also using hyper-personalization, where we're actually asking customers to seed us with their interests. So tell us what you're into. Do you like Star Wars? What's your shoe size? What's your favorite color? Do you like vintage records? Do you like motorbikes? And when we get this information from you, instead of following you around on the internet and guessing what you might like, we serve you more relevant things. So these are the things that we're interested on with the customer at the center.
Mm-hmm. And finally, Ben, you work in a slightly different area, browsers.
So we are a consumer-facing product, right? So we are a web browser, Brave browser. You can go to brave.com, check it out, download it, runs on your laptop, runs on your mobile device as well. So we are there to, one of the fundamental principles behind Brave, the Brave browser, is to protect the privacy of the end user. So to do so, we block third-party advertising, which means that the user experience is a lot cleaner, oftentimes a lot faster. In many of our measurements, we see improvements, speed improvements of 4 to 8x, which is really quite significant, especially on mobile devices. Now, what about AI? Where does AI come into play? What we're trying to do is we're trying to disrupt fundamentally the way advertising is done online. And what we observe is that one can do so by modeling users' preferences, doing user modeling on the device itself in a privacy-preserving manner, and then doing ad targeting within the device itself, and that's what we do. And of course, there are lots of interesting technical challenges that stem from that, which is how to do high-quality targeting better than the traditional competition does. And also, not only advertising, there are interesting opportunities for site personalization. How do we augment websites, for example, right, in a way that appeals to the end user the most? That's where we come in terms of machine learning within the browser.
So actually on that point, Ben, what about publishers who are being told that it's a post-advertising world, you know, the future is around subscription, it's not about advertising necessarily. Are publishers one of your clients? Are they interested in technology and the way in which you're using it?
So the landscape has changed really significantly for publishers in the last several years alone because of the quite frankly, the power of two really big companies, Facebook plus Google, which account for about 90% of all advertising revenue. Which means oftentimes that publishers are sort of squeezed out of that picture. Their revenues are not what they used to be. So many of them, not all, but certainly many of them, are really keen to explore different monetization schemes, and this is why you see, say, The Guardian or some website like that, pushing users, pushing viewers to sign up and pay on a monthly basis. So I think we'll see a continuum of models developing here, all the way from sort of subscriptions to, you pay for a single visit, which is effectively a form of micropayments, and Brave is there to effectively support all of these models.
Mm-hmm. Okay. And what about performance or performance analytics for other areas? What improvements have you seen, Anastasia, on behalf of your clients?
Yeah, absolutely. So we like to break it up into what we call sort of the soft metrics and the hard metrics. The soft metrics are basically just the level of knowledge and awareness in an organization. What we see is typically when we go into an organization, before we reveal some of the creative level insights that our system unearths, we try and have them guess what they think the visual preferences of their audiences are. And what we find over and over again is that 90% of them are wrong all the time, right? And this is in some ways where A/B testing was 5 years ago, where people thought, we don't need A/B testing, we know if it's the green color button or the red color button, that will work, versus now we actually trust that there are some things intuition might not necessarily predict. So the first way we measure it is, can we get the whole organization on the same level around what is actually resonating with your audience from a creative point of view? Now, once that data starts to get implemented, the performance KPIs we've seen have really run the gamut. So for example, we worked with one makeup company who got their CPAs for app installs down, and this is a major global makeup company, from 10 pounds per install to 1 pound per install using only visual data optimization. We have fashion companies who've seen click-through and CPC decreases of 25 to 30%. I think oftentimes it's about taking this creative level data and combining with sort of the brand ethos that you have. So there are still some battles that we're fighting. Obviously, when we tell you, hey, blondes perform better for you if you're Louis Vuitton, that doesn't mean you're going to put a blonde in every ad, but it is thinking about what does that mean for your audience. So the level of performance tends to vary with how much of these creative level insights the brand is actually willing to then incorporate into their creative. One of the things we've done to come around that is we've essentially launched the compliance product, which I know is terribly unsexy, but what it does is it takes all the creatives you have in-house, automates all of your brand rules, and then tells you within the huge library or repository of content that you have, what is actually meeting the brand guidelines that you have to help you at least find the right content.
Okay. So what about personalization, Jessica? Because you talked a bit about that, and I know you've done a big piece of work on customer segmentation.
Yeah.
It's the holy grail. We hear about it all around the festival, of course. How are you going to get to the individual customer and understand them in that level of detail? What's missing? What would you like to do next?
Well, I think you still need an overarching brand strategy. So as you talked about, what are your kind of brand hierarchy or rules, and you want to fit within that framework. So you still need a traditional customer segmentation just to have a North Star for the company. And so what we did in analytics was now that we have so much data, it's actually much more difficult to do a customer segmentation than it used to be. So now we can apply some machine learning to our customer segmentation and look for interactions or linkages between purchases. So if someone who buys this lipstick also buys this phone cover or also buys this motorbike part, and just try to actually put together personas. And that actually told us something which wasn't all that surprising, which is that the most discriminant variables in terms of how the wider world interacts with eBay are gender, and the presence of children in your family and the age of the children as opposed to the age of the individual. And so these kinds of things just help us as a strategy team figure out which customer segments do we want to market to if we're not marketing to everyone at the same time. And then having that feed into kind of a traditional holistic customer research, go out, actually speak to real customers, and then blend that back in with the machine learning and kind of data algorithm. Make sure that we're not making any mistakes and we're not kind of just following the data down a rabbit hole. So we want to be sure that we have a brand strategy that holds together and fits with everything we want to do.
I guess a lot of brands would say they've always been doing that. They've always been closely connected and really understand their customers, like a John Lewis or whoever.
Yeah.
Is machine learning really adding a huge percentage of improvement of performance?
I think it does now when you have the volumes of data that you have, and now you're sort of looking at customers' other behaviors out there on Twitter and Facebook, and now you have things like what's your emotional intelligence at the time. I actually just recently rewatched the Minority Report, and I was reflecting how that 20-year-old film was actually showing images to Tom Cruise based on his emotional state as he was fleeing the law enforcement authorities. Would you like a holiday? Do you fancy a back massage? You know, they were kind of reacting to his emotional state. And so I think as we try to get smarter and actually offer up our customers better, well-placed adverts at the right time to the right person at the right place, what it means is we're processing huge amounts of data to make those predictions more accurate. So yes, there is a role to play, even though the overall framework is still the same. You're just doing it supersize on huge quantities of data, which makes machine learning more relevant.
Now Ben, things that consumers do find highly emotional, privacy and security at the moment. It's in the news. Brands, media owners, platforms under more scrutiny than they probably were even, 2 months ago. Yep. Can you talk a bit about how important privacy is for consumers? Because there's a bit of a debate. It's in the news. People say they're worried about it, but actually their browsing behavior or their online behavior doesn't necessarily bear that out, does it?
So, I mean, privacy is a bit of a funny topic, right? So, for two reasons. Every time you ask somebody, well, do you care about privacy? Of course, the answer will be yes. But then their behavior is a little bit different. So, express preferences, as they say, are a little bit different from actual preference. So, we know that. That's one thing. The other thing is that there's quite a range of privacy attitudes, right? So, there are people who are, you know, if you will, privacy fanatics, and then there are people who are the don't cares, right? No matter what happens, they're happy to upload their, you know, email to a public website or Twitter, and they'll be just fine. And then there's this big group of people in the middle, you know, some say it might be something like 80%, who are privacy pragmatists, right? So they'll be, you know, open to incentives, but they'll kind of try to do the sensible thing depending on the conversation and interaction that they're having with a service provider. Yeah. So, and this is partially perhaps the reason why you hear different things depending whom you ask. And of course, there are people who are privacy activists who will take a very high road most of the time, and those people are really quite vocal, but that's not everybody at the same time either. So we're hoping to provide things that will appeal to a wide range of users. So we'll be implementing features that will appeal to people who really deeply care about privacy, like support for Tor in private browser tabs, but that's not going to be everybody. We realize that at the same time, right? At the same time, though, there is clearly a wave there, and we're trying to ride that wave. And there are at least two forces there, one of which is GDPR that came into effect just, a couple of weeks ago, less than that even? Yeah. 10 days ago, maybe?
May, yeah. 25th?
2 weeks ago, yeah. 25th of May. Thank you. And then the other one is, you know, this whole, you know, upheaval around Facebook and Cambridge Analytica and subjects related to that. And we are starting to see, you know, it's not quite a mass movement, but an increasing number of people are starting to get concerned and starting to get vocal, and people are leaving Facebook as well. And so, you know, that's an indication to us that the traditional model, if you will, which is to say centralized server-based model, when it comes to machine learning as well, is not everything that perhaps there should be. And so we come in and say, well, why don't we try to do client-based edge machine learning and see how that works out. And of course, this is a fundamentally very difficult task because you're trying to deliver high-quality experiences, highly personalized experiences based on a lot less data, while also keeping it private to the user.
So is it true that we have to trade privacy of our data for a better experience? Or is that something we've been suckered into by the platforms telling us that because they want our data? What is the solution, and is that a true trade-off?
I don't think that's a true trade-off at all. So I don't think that's a trade-off that we have to agree to in a sense, right? I mean, in part, again, so what we do within the browser is that we do user modeling to the client within the browser. And we can do user modeling on everything we see in terms of interactions between the user and the websites they visit, which is oftentimes a lot more than an individual provider, such as, say, Google or Facebook, will get to see. Now, we get to see a lot more, but of course we have, because of that, a heightened level of responsibility not to share, not to let that data, or derivative data for that matter, to leave the end user's device. Now, there are tons of hard technical problems there, a lot really, but there is also an opportunity that within that model, because we're not sharing user data, we can get levels of personalization that are potentially higher, and the quality of interactions and experiences that are potentially more engaging than what is possible with the big data model, if you will.
That's a really
centralized
interesting
model.
question.
Yes.
I think it's a really interesting question for the audience because, I mean, for everyone here right now, raise your hand if you think you've had a better experience on the internet because of this data trade-off that you've made. Right, I mean, that's maybe 10% of the people who raised their hand. Mm-hmm. So I think that at least gives us some sense of what consumer sentiment is around this trade-off that you're making.
Mm-hmm. And I think we're trying to do it more sensibly as well. At eBay, we're very conscious about data privacy, and we want to protect our customers' data. Now, we don't hold banking data or the very private data that some other sites might have, but we actually are trying to strike this balance by actually asking customers to tell us what is it about you that you want us to know, rather than us trying to stalk you around and just assume things about you or maybe show you things that really aren't relevant to you. So I think it is striking that balance, and you want to be more relevant, and I think customers will realize that in return for the information they share with you, if they get a better experience, they'll find that rewarding. But I think all of us can say in the past couple of weeks being inundated with GDPR tick the box exercises, I think we've all seen that everyone, for as much as they want to do to be compliant, everyone is just, you're kind of forced to tick the box and say you agree with whatever the new terms and conditions are in order to continue your relationship with whichever that company is. And I've personally probably had 50,000 emails in the past 2 weeks.
I've had more email marketing than since unsubscribing than when I was subscribed. So I don't think it's quite right.
If I may, can I have a question for the audience? I'm sure you've received, hundreds in some cases of these GDPR notices asking you to please opt into this service, email, newsletter, whatever. So how many of you have opted into more than 10 of those things? More than 10? Like I see about 7 hands actually. So I think by implication, this sort of means that a lot of these services will operate on a lot less data as time goes by, which means that they'll have to figure out a way to do so. So we're sort of a little bit ahead of that curve is the way I see it.
So would you like to see more or less regulation of some of the biggest players in the market, some of the platforms? Or do you think it's about right? What's your view, Anastasia?
Well, I don't know if I'm the right person. My background also, I spent 6 years at Google, so I don't know if I'm the right person to ask this question. So
I think you definitely are.
I mean, look, I think it depends on what side of the fence you sit on. As a founder, my general answer is when there is no regulation, it's a really good time to be a founder because there's a lot of opportunity to be seized. So sort of personally, I think some lack of regulation is a good thing for innovation and entrepreneurship. Of course, you get to a point where it goes too far and you need things to come in, but typically what we see, at least of copyright law and patent law as any indication, is those legal fields are about 20 years behind where the practices actually are. So, should there be more regulation in some of these things? Absolutely, but I also think our regulators need to become much more educated about what these companies are actually doing. As we were talking backstage, watching Zuckerberg's testimony, to me, one of the things it made very clear is how little the US congressmen and senators actually understood about how Facebook worked, the data it kept and shared, and how it made money. And so fundamentally, I think it's these companies will continue to get away with what they're allowed to get away with. And so the onus isn't just on them, it's also on the other side of the ecosystem.
Absolutely. Always remember, Facebook isn't a monopoly. You've been doing a lot of work on regulation, haven't you?
Yeah, so I spend a lot of my time, in fact, most of my time these days on VAT or tax regulation. So one of the most important things for eBay is making sure that all of the sellers that trade on the site are VAT compliant. And tax is not a very sexy subject, but it's very important that we stay compliant and make sure that our sellers pay the right amount of tax. In the past, it was up to the individual taxpayer to make sure they're paying tax. And now, because it's so complicated for regulators to kind of keep up with who's doing what, where, and why, they're actually asking platforms to become the tax man on their behalf. And so that is something that eBay and Amazon and a lot of other marketplaces are now having to do. But they are now just catching up with the fact that the world has moved on and people are transacting differently, and that this needs to happen. But I don't think they've moved on at the pace that they do need to move on to understand these kind of intricacies around how Facebook works or privacy laws, and in particular machine learning and AI. What do we need to do to make sure that as that technology takes off, that we have the right regulatory interface or construct to make sure that our rights as consumers are protected, and I don't think they are.
No. So I imagine that quite soon, in a couple of years or whatever, we'll be using biometrics in a lot more mainstream way. So another kind of visual imagery, if you will.
Absolutely.
Yeah. If regulators aren't really coping very well with advertising as it is at the moment, and marketing materials and communication, how on earth are they going to get ahead or even stay up to date with what's happening with biometrics? Does anybody want to speak to that? Because I think that is obviously the future, where you become the interface and the communication is through.
So I have no idea how regulators are going to deal with that. One interesting thing I've seen some founders working on is, and there is actually a team at MIT who's tackling this as well, is this concept of essentially a consumer data exchange. So the idea is, and I think GDPR made the need for this very obvious, which is that you can give your data to any third party that you want, but at any point in time you can revoke it. And there's a centralized interface for managing this. And you would imagine with GDPR actually would have been a lot easier if you had one place and you could at any time say, well, actually these companies, I want to take my info out. And at some point, when you're looking for something specific, you might say, okay, give my information to these furniture companies. Once you've bought it, you may no longer want them to have it. So, potentially with biometric data, because it is so much more sensitive and gives rise to everything from your passport to, your possible health data and all of that, maybe we'll start to see a shift to the consumer having a little bit more control. I think that's highly optimistic, but we are seeing some very smart people working on this.
Maybe not in China.
Yeah, maybe not in China, no.
I want to shift the conversation a little bit towards how you're working with creatives and agencies, if you are, because obviously advertising is only going to move as fast as those agencies are, media agencies or creative agencies or publishing houses, as fast as they are willing to take on some of this new thinking and change their processes and actually upskill some of the people. So when we talk about the future of work and some of the skills and the competencies and the roles that will be lost, often it's in planning roles where lots of automated services take over. And you and I had quite an interesting conversation about what is the response from advertising and media agencies towards this kind of automation, especially if you're talking about your services being almost the guardian of the brand visual?
Yeah, so we've sort of seen it all. I think it depends on the kind of agency you are. So we work quite a bit with media agencies and research and data agencies. Creative agencies, I would say, have a love-hate relationship with us, probably more on the hate side than the love side. But we have had what I consider the sort of the right creative directors who've seen the data we provide, and their response has not been, you're going to take away my job or you're going to make what we do obsolete. It's actually been, you're going to help us win arguments that we're currently losing with our clients. Because if you guys have ever been in a room where a creative idea is being pitched, unfortunately, the way that conversation tends to go is if a senior person doesn't like it, that's the end of the conversation, right? So if you actually have data to more politely say, look, you might not like it, but here's data to say our consumers do, so it doesn't really matter what you think, more diplomatically, of course, then I think it actually because look, at any room, creative has the least data. When you're talking about media planners, analytics folks, et cetera, creative tends to have the least data. And so I think a lot of times they're losing battles instead of winning them. But I think for creatives that has been, and I think part of it is our fault, of course, because we came in with all this talk about AI, which is, I think, not oftentimes the best way to position a technology that could be seen as not being very friendly.
So they're working in a complementary manner?
That's what look, we try very much not to be prescriptive. We say this is data that should help you find that new kind of global maxima of change. If you can understand what your consumers are responding to, what are the visual cues that are really resonating with them, the right creative should be able to take that nutshell and put it on steroids and take it further. We're not creating, we're not saying, okay, blondes and dogs and babies work better, so here's an ad. We're never going to do that.
But they do, though, don't they?
Well, there was an experiment that did that, and the ads were awful. I mean, I don't know if you guys saw it. You can Google on the ad, or you can search for it on the internet. The ads were categorically bad. So that is not the approach we're coming in from. We're coming in from a data approach, which is here's the data. And now you guys don't have to spend time guessing or kind of digging in data. You can spend that creative time thinking about how do we take that data and take it to the next level.
I mean, presumably, it might potentially eradicate some sort of unconscious bias in the creative teams, mightn't it? I mean, I always remember working with very male teams, male creative directors. You'd never see, mum and baby and things like because it wasn't part of the world and it wasn't necessarily what they aspired to.
Yes.
But maybe if it's in your user-generated content and it's coming back, it's an insight about the audience, right?
Right. Or we've done this a lot for brands where they've said, and this always kind of is further on to the relationship. But I said, well, can you look into things like skin color or the model? Like for fashion, they've asked, can you look at if body size makes a difference for some of these luxury brands? And oftentimes what we're actually seeing for some of the very luxury fashion brands, that plus size models generate more engagement than very skinny models. And so at least having that data to say, look, this is not going to hurt your brand. Here are the customer segments that are responding really well to this. And that's, you can drag that all the way from, engagement rate all the way to conversion. That helps a lot. For another major global CPG brand, we've shown that there's no statistical difference in performance based on skin color. So if you're hesitating about whether to put models of color in your creatives, actually there's data, at least for this one company, that the model skin color did not change performance for them.
That's fascinating.
Which is, we think really, again, I'm sure it won't always be like that, but we're hoping that this is the beginning of having a much more informed conversation.
So part of the lesson there is surely to look at the specifics, your brand, your market, not just say, we've got to have 50%, I don't know, a certain colour, we've got to have 50% this age, but it's too general, isn't it?
Sure, yeah.
Okay. Now, what about inside a client organisation? Who is helping to work with external partners on AI? Where do the decisions sit?
Well, in terms of creative, we've engaged a company called 72 and Sunny, and as you said, sometimes people at the top have a particular preference. We were looking for a company, eBay recently redid all of their brand strategy and campaign, and we're very much focused on diversity now. We've brought in a chief diversity officer. Diversity of both our seller base and our customer base has always been something intrinsically important to us, and we wanted to try to find a way to put that into our advertising campaign. And we did something similar to what you were describing, where we were testing different taglines in all the markets. And when you have a company that invents something first for North America, and then you have to replicate that consistent brand strategy across Italy and Spain and Germany, you need to make sure that that tagline works everywhere. So it was the job of my team to go out and test that fill your cart with color, and how that exact translation would work in every European market would make sense and resonate with those customers, and also mean the same thing. What we were trying to mean is to imply the diversity of shopping, and not the actual aspect of color. So fill your cart with color was a very interesting challenge for us to both kind of land the actual creative and the marketing of it, and then make sure that it got replicated in a consistent way across all the countries.
Fascinating. Ben?
We're starting with a self-service model, right? So one should be able to buy an ad that will be delivered to end users through Brave. This is the beginning then. So here's something that's really quite interesting, which is Brave is a company that's been funded in part based on a cryptocurrency, based on a token called Basic Attention Token, or BAT. So what does it all mean? Well, it means a lot of things, but one of them is that users are rewarded for their attention. So if users choose to watch, I don't know, one ad or two or three, they will receive 1 BAT or 2 BAT or 3 in their wallet that's sitting within their browser, and then they can go home and watch a video, say, for which they'll pay using these tokens. This is a powerful model, and the part of it that I just described concerns just what? Just the ad or ad producer maybe, and then the end user. Now, our hope is that long term, perhaps much longer term, we'll have other players within that ecosystem that circles around the cryptocurrency, circles around BAT. So potentially longer term, we'll have ad agencies, right? And media buyers and potentially others that are involved within this as well, that are paying each other for services using the token as well. Now this might not happen. Let me give you a disclaimer here, but longer term that's something that's interesting to ponder as well. While in the short run, while near term we are looking at a self-service model.
And is that for all kinds? Is there a demographic across users who are more interested in that?
In terms of our initial user cohort?
Yeah.
Well, we definitely have at the moment, right? So given our download numbers and our user numbers, we definitely have a preference from users who are interested in privacy, who are interested in cryptocurrencies, and a few topics of that nature. And certainly you expect to see demographics of people, for example, who are younger. You definitely see that trend. But again, as the product grows, we should hopefully resemble what it is in the general population also.
Now, I want to use just the last sort of 6 or 7 minutes we've got to maybe, for the audience, there's no Q&A here, but I thought if we could ask the panelists each for a bit of a story or a tip or a hint or a piece of advice, perhaps what they wish they'd have known as they embarked on some of this disruptive technology. For people who may be embarking on their own AI transformation processes or disrupting their advertising or marketing businesses, what would you want to give them as a takeaway to start thinking about, or do you have some particular learnings from your own experience, whether at Google or Picasso Labs?
So I wish this were my tidbit, but it's something an investor said to me very early on in our journey, which always stuck with me. He said, with any given company that says they do AI or machine learning, he says, there are machines and there is learning, but it's always the machines that are learning. And that's always really stayed with me, because I think when you're setting up an AI company, that really tends to be true. And so, and the lesson in that is that if you are building an AI company, you are shooting yourselves in the foot if it's not your machines that are learning from a very early point in time, because that's really the competitive advantage that kind of compounds over time. And so that has kind of been one of the core principles that we've really tried, and again, sometimes it's really tough. So that's one thing. The second thing, and I come at it more from I studied psychology at university, so I kind of pop psychoanalyze the whole team all the time, which is super annoying. But when you are talking about AI or selling AI to clients or trying to use AI within an organization, make sure in the same way that it's the machines are learning, that the people are always aware of how their job is ideally going to change for the better as a result of that. I think the reason why we don't have as much of a sort of adoption or understanding of AI as we should is because people see this as an either-or equation, not at a here's how, things will change, of course, but here's how they change for the better. For most individuals who, let's be honest, don't want to do rote tasks, they want to think and they want to be clever and they want to be creative. And AI could actually enable us to do that by automating a lot of the manual stuff we've all had to do in our career. So,
It's like in advertising when we used to present creative work and the client would then write a letter to us a week later, and then we'd take that response on board and write a letter back. This is just another tool, isn't it? So in a way, you're not selling the AI, it's the benefits of it.
That's right.
For how it can improve what you're doing. Yeah, brilliant. Jessica?
Yeah, I can agree. So in my journey at eBay in analytics, when I sort of came into the organization, it was very operational analytics or sort of day-to-day analytical tasks. And my job was to kind of create this diverse team that could do advanced analytics. And there was the same hesitancy as well, I think, around ML and AI and kind of learning new things. And what we did is sort of embraced it as a learning opportunity and just said, let's all get together on one project cross-functionally and take researchers and people with history degrees and psychology degrees and data scientists and Python programmers, and let's all just collaborate together and do this as a cross-functional project, and we'll all learn together on this journey. And I think doing it that way was a great way for us all to learn together and to really bring diversity of minds. I am a really strong believer that you can't just set about having the most intelligent person and just sit them in a corner and have them go off and create this kind of analytically perfect model. You really need that human collaboration, and at the end of the day, whatever you build, you do have to go out and talk to real customers and make sure that it resonates. So I think this fear, maybe there should be fear someday in the future, but right here, right now, there's a lot of human interaction and real blood, sweat, and tears that need to happen to make modeling real.
If you're going to build that corporate knowledge, though, you need continuity of the people on your team. How do you keep people there on the project over time?
It's really tough. It's really tough because there's a lot of turnover at eBay, as I think there is at a lot of tech companies. People are always on to the next opportunity, or they're in a rotational program. They've moved to California, they've moved to Germany, they're somewhere. But in terms of the continuity, it's about actually when something takes off at eBay, it's just sort of adopted by the organization. It's this kind of an osmosis thing. So this thing that we built for Europe, for UK and German customers, customer segmentation, it was actually presented last week at Leaders Week in California by someone completely who's not me, and it's just been adopted by the company, and now it's become part of the way we talk about our customer segmentation. So I think when something's successful, you don't have to worry about it getting lost. It just gets adopted by the company, and then other teams pick up on it and learn on it, and that's kind of how eBay is. There's analysts everywhere. It's very distributed. Anytime somebody invents something really cool, other people hear about it, and then it's gone.
So it's not.
There's no IP.
Analytics isn't siloed. Yeah. Ben, you're the last one to speak on this. Give us a zinger to finish off our panel discussion.
Well, so one thing is that we are in a pretty established product category, right? So browsers have been around for about, 20 years, 22 years, I forget. Mosaic was, I guess, the first one. So a lot of the engineers are excellent engineers and really hardcore hackers. They really know how to deal with C++ and things like that. And to them, oftentimes, AI is something that exists in some other parallel universe or on the side or in a portion of the company that they don't visit very much, right? So they tend to treat it as a black box that they much of the time avoid. And so planning for that and creating pathways and figuring out ways to bring those silos, and it sometimes does take a fair bit of work, is something that we definitely need to do and need to do more of. And the earlier you start, I think the better off you are, because even in an established category like what we have, you cannot really afford to exist for very long without introducing some elements of machine learning and AI sort of across the board.
So disrupt yourselves before you get disrupted.
But do it gently and plan ahead.
Gentle disruption. We'll leave it on that. Gentle disruption.
Yeah.
Could we please thank the panel, please, this week? and close our session. Thank you.